The air in the hangar-turned mess hall at FOB Erebus was a thick cocktail of competing miseries. It smelled of stale coffee, diesel fumes from the overworked generators, and the pervasive metallic grit of the endless desert that lay just beyond the canvas flaps. Fluorescent lights hummed a weary, monotonous tune, casting a sterile, greenish pallor on the faces of the men and women scattered across the mismatched tables and chairs. It was a place built for transient function, not comfort, and it wore its purpose like a shroud. The constant, low-frequency roar of the wind against the structure's metal skeleton was a reminder that the world outside was actively hostile, a vast, indifferent ocean of sand and rock that had no patience for the temporary human outpost clawed into its surface. This was a place at the edge of the map, a punctuation mark of defiant existence in a sentence written by geology and time, and the atmosphere within its walls reflected that precariousness. Every clang of a dropped fork, every burst of hollow laughter, seemed amplified, and then immediately swallowed by the oppressive, humming silence that followed. At a small table in the corner, far from the boisterous cluster of Marines near the serving line, a woman sat alone. She was the very picture of unremarkable. Her name, according to the laminated contractor badge clipped to her drab, sand-colored utility vest, was Elias Vance. She looked to be in her mid-30s, though the unforgiving light and the subtle lines of fatigue around her eyes could have added or subtracted a decade. Her hair was a simple, nondescript brown, pulled back in a severe bun that was more about efficiency than style. She wore no makeup, no jewelry, save for a plain, functional watch on her wrist. Her frame was slight, almost lost inside the practical, pocket-laden clothing. She was eating a bowl of something gray and vaguely stew-like, her movements economical and precise. She did not look up. She did not engage. She simply existed within her own small bubble of quiet, a ghost at the feast of forced camaraderie. To the casual observer, she was just another one of the civilian support staff, an atmospheric technician or a logistics clerk, a necessary but ultimately invisible cog in the great, grinding machine of the forward operating base. She was a study in stillness, a fixed point in the restless churn of the room. That stillness was a magnet for the room's primary source of kinetic energy, Gunnery Sergeant Rex Thorne. Thorne was a man carved from the very archetype of a Marine non-commissioned officer. He was built like a reinforced concrete barrier, with a neck as thick as a mortar tube and a jaw that looked like it could crack granite. His head was shaved to the scalp, accentuating a face that seemed permanently set in a sneer of condescending authority. Tattoos, intricate tapestries of skulls, eagles, and arcane unit iconography snaked from his collar and cuffs, each one a billboard advertising a chapter in his self-aggrandizing personal history. He moved through the mess hall not as a guest, but as a landlord, his boots striking the metal floor with a proprietary clang. His voice, a gravelly boom that needed no amplification, was the dominant sound in the room, a constant broadcast of jokes, commands, and casual derision. He was the center of his own gravity, and he expected all lesser bodies to fall into his orbit. To him, the world was a simple hierarchy, and he stood firmly on one of the higher rungs, especially within the confines of this dusty purgatory. Thorne's patrol through his domain brought his eyes to the quiet corner. He saw the woman, Vance. He saw her civilian attire, her quiet demeanor, her utter lack of deference to the uniformed ecosystem around her. In his mind, a simple and brutally efficient calculating engine of prejudice, these inputs produced a single output: weakness, an anomaly, an object of casual sport. He saw a nail that was not hammered down, and he was the living embodiment of the hammer. He nudged one of his corporals, a younger Marine who orbited him like a nervous moon. "Hey, check it out. Think the new weather girl's enjoying the five-star cuisine?" His voice carried easily across the room, a stone tossed into the quiet pool of Vance's solitude. Several of the other Marines chuckled, the sound sycophantic and eager. They knew the rhythms of their gunny's moods, and they recognized the prelude to a familiar performance. Vance did not react. She continued to eat, her spoon moving from the bowl to her mouth with the same unhurried, metronomic rhythm. She did not look up. She did not stiffen. It was as if the sound had simply passed through her, a frequency to which her senses were not attuned. This, more than any defiant retort, was an irritant to Thorn. His brand of authority relied on a reaction. Fear, anger, submission, it did not matter. What it could not tolerate was indifference. It was a negation of his presence, a denial of his power. He sauntered over, his two acolytes trailing in his wake, the metal floor groaning slightly under their combined weight. He stopped directly in front of her table, casting a large shadow that fell across her meal. The air grew thick with a new kind of tension, the ambient hum of the hangar now underscored by a sharp, personal silence. The conversations at nearby tables faltered and died as people turned to watch the impending collision. "Hey, I'm talking to you." Thorn's voice was lower now, but more menacing. It was the growl a big dog makes just before it bites. He leaned forward, planting his massive, scarred hands on her small table. The flimsy metal creaked in protest. "Got rocks in your ears, contractor? Or you just think you're too good to talk to the hired help?" The irony of the statement was completely lost on him. He saw himself as the institution, and her as the interloper. He was the house, and she was a guest who had forgotten her manners. Vance finished the spoonful of stew she was eating. She placed the spoon down carefully beside the bowl, the small metallic click a sharp report in the charged silence. Then, and only then, did she lift her head. Her eyes were a pale, washed-out gray, and they held no fear, no anger, no emotion at all. They were the color of a winter sky over a frozen sea. They were analytical. They simply registered his presence, catalogued his posture, noted the faint tremor of aggression in his clenched jaw. She looked at him with the detached curiosity of a scientist observing a microbe under a lens. "I heard you, Gunnery Sergeant," she said. Her voice was calm, level, and devoid of any inflection. It was a simple statement of fact, the absolute lack of emotional response was gasoline on the fire of Thorn's ego. He had expected a flustered apology, a nervous justification, perhaps even a flash of anger he could then punish. He had not expected nothing. He was faced with a perfect, placid surface that reflected his own blustering aggression back at him, and it infuriated him. He felt his face flush, the blood rising to his cheeks. "You heard me? Good. Then maybe you can answer the question. Or is that too complicated for the civilian brain trust? Let me spell it out for you. This is a Marine mess. See the uniforms? We fight. We bleed. What the hell do you do? Stare at a computer screen and tell us if it's going to be hot and sandy tomorrow? A job a trained monkey could do." He gestured vaguely at the computer terminal in the corner of the room, where weather charts scrolled in endless, placid green lines. He was playing to his audience, the ring of Marines who now stood watching, their faces a mixture of amusement and apprehension. "My work is more complex than that," Vance stated. Again, it was not a defense. It was a clarification, delivered with the same flat affect as a pilot reading a pre-flight checklist. She did not raise her voice. She did not lean away from his looming presence. She simply sat there, a small island of unnerving calm in a sea of his manufactured hostility. She was a lioness, allowing a jackal to dance at the edge of its kill radius, and the jackal was too arrogant to understand the danger. It saw only the lack of a visible response and mistook it for fear. This clinical detachment finally broke something in Thorne. His need for a reaction, for a purchase point on her psyche, overwhelmed the last vestiges of his professional discipline. He straightened up, his face a mask of theatrical disgust. Complex? Lady, you wouldn't know complex if it bit you on your overpaid ass. He then did something that shifted the encounter from verbal harassment to physical assault. He reached down and, with a flick of his wrist, tipped her table. The bowl, the spoon, and a plastic cup of water crashed to the floor in a messy sprawl. The gray stew splattered across the dusty concrete. The sound was sharp, ugly, and final. It was a violation. The room went dead silent. Even Thorne's most ardent followers seemed to recognize a line had been crossed. This was no longer barracks hazing. It was a public physical humiliation of a civilian non-combatant. Elias Vance did not flinch. She did not gasp. She did not look at the mess on the floor. Her gaze remained fixed on Thorne's face. She watched him, her expression unchanged, as if she were merely logging this new data point. She slowly, deliberately, rose to her feet. She was not tall, and Thorne towered over her, a mountain of muscle and rage. But in that moment, the dynamic of power in the room felt strangely inverted. Her stillness held more weight than all his blustering motion. She stood before him, looked him directly in the eye, and the silence stretched, becoming thin and brittle, ready to shatter. The entire population of Fob Erebus, it seemed, was holding its collective breath, waiting to see what this quiet, unassuming woman would do next. And then, the world ended. It did not begin with a boom, but with a sound, or rather, the absence of one. The constant, familiar drone of the base generators, the very heartbeat of their manufactured existence, suddenly choked and died. The fluorescent lights overhead flickered once, twice, and then plunged the cavernous hangar into an abyssal, disorienting darkness. For a single, terrifying second, the only sound was the collective sharp intake of breath from 24 throats. Then, the emergency lights, spaced far apart along the walls, kicked in with a hum and a chemical buzz, casting long, monstrous shadows and painting the scene in a sickly, crimson glow. The world was now red and black. Simultaneously, the ambient roar of the wind outside changed its pitch. It escalated from a persistent moan into a high-frequency, demonic shriek. It was a sound of immense power, of air being torn apart. The entire metal structure of the hangar began to groan, a deep, tortured sound of stressed steel and shearing rivets. A fine dust, shaken from the rafters, began to fall like a foul, gritty snow. The canvas flaps at the entrance of the mess hall, which had been secured with heavy-duty straps, were ripped from their moorings with a sound like cannon fire. They vanished into the maelstrom outside. A wall of sand, a solid churning thing that was more like a tidal wave than a weather event, blasted into the room. It was not just wind. It was an avalanche of fine-ground rock moving at incomprehensible speed. Panic erupted. It was a sudden, ugly bloom of fear. Marines, trained for combat, were now facing an enemy they could not shoot. They scrambled, shouting, their voices thin and reedy against the deafening roar of the storm. Men collided in the red-tinged gloom. Someone screamed as a loose piece of sheet metal, torn from the ceiling, cartwheeled through the air and embedded itself in a stack of supply crates. The base's emergency siren began to wail, but its sound was immediately shredded and swallowed by the greater, more primal scream of the wind. This was not a sandstorm. This was a physical assault by the planet itself. The standard operating procedure, the laminated cards that told them to seek shelter and wait, was a laughable fiction in the face of this reality. The shelter itself was failing. Gunnery Sergeant Thorne, for his part, reacted as he had been trained. He began to bellow orders. "Everyone down! Get away from the walls! Find cover!" But his voice, usually a tool of absolute command, was just another noise in the cacophony. His orders were generic, instinctual, and ultimately useless. He was shouting at a hurricane. He was trying to impose military order on geological chaos. His authority, which had seemed so absolute just moments before, evaporated into the swirling, sand-choked air. He was just another terrified man in a red-lit room that was being torn apart around him. He shoved a young private towards the relative safety of the solid-built serving line, his face a mask of confusion and dawning horror. The confidence and arrogance had been sandblasted away, leaving only the raw, twitching nerve of a man who had lost all control. The world had ceased to obey the rules he understood. In the midst of this primal chaos, as the building shuddered and the air grew thick enough to chew, one person was not moving. One person was not shouting. Elias Vance stood in the very same spot she had been when the lights went out, a pillar of impossible tranquility in the heart of the vortex. The red emergency lights cast her in demonic relief. The wind whipped her hair from its bun, and it flew around her head like a wild corona. Sand blasted against her face, but she did not blink. She simply stood, her head tilted slightly, as if she were listening to something beneath the noise, a secret rhythm hidden within the storm's fury. Then she moved. It was not a panicked scramble, but a flow. Her movements were fluid, economical, and imbued with a terrifying purpose. While others were driven by fear, she was guided by an invisible blueprint of action. She moved through the chaos as if it were not there, her body weaving around panicked soldiers and falling debris with a preternatural grace. Her destination was a reinforced steel locker in the far corner of the hangar, one marked with a series of complex, esoteric hazard symbols that everyone else ignored. She did not fumble with the lock. Her fingers danced over a digital keypad, entering a code with swift, practiced precision. The locker hissed open. Inside was not the gear of a weather analyst. It was a suite of hardened, military-grade electronics, a ruggedized comms system, and several strange-looking devices that resembled a cross between a sensor and a weapon. She ignored it all. Her hands went to a simple, heavy-duty headset with a boom microphone and a single, sealed earpiece. She donned it, settling it into place with a practiced motion. She then unspooled a thick, armored cable from the locker, and with a swift, powerful twist, jacked it into a port on the wall labeled Structural Seismics and Atmospheric Liaison, Priority Channel Omega. It was a port no one had ever used, a relic of the base's initial, high-tech construction phase that had long since been forgotten by the rotational units. The moment the cable connected, a new voice entered the world. It was her voice, but it was not the same. It was amplified, filtered through the high-powered comm system, and it cut through the roar of the storm and the din of panic with the clean, sharp edge of a surgeon's scalpel. It was a voice of absolute, unquestionable authority. All call signs, this is Vance. I am declaring a Condition 0 event, Protocol Chimera. All standard emergency procedures are now void. Your orders are superseded. Acknowledge. Her voice boomed from the hangar's own internal address system, which had suddenly, inexplicably, come back to life. The sound shocked the panicked men into a momentary stillness. They looked around, bewildered, trying to find the source of the godlike command. They saw the small, plain woman, now tethered by a cable to the wall, her face illuminated by the green glow of a small diagnostic screen on the comms unit. She did not look at them. Her eyes were closed, her expression one of intense, focused concentration. A voice, crackling with static, came back through the speakers. It was the base commander, a major hunkered down in the command post. "Who the hell is this? We are under emergency protocol. Identify yourself." "Negative, command," Vance's voice replied, sharp and cold, radiating an authority that made the major's rank seem like a quaint formality. "You are experiencing a mesoscale convective vortex with a rotational velocity exceeding 200 knots, complicated by an inverse barometric pressure drop. Your command post will experience catastrophic structural failure in approximately 90 seconds. I am rerouting essential personnel command authority to this node. Do not argue. The algorithm does not permit it." Her words were a foreign language of expertise. Algorithm, condition 0, protocol chimera. It was jargon from a world they did not know existed. She was not describing the storm. She was dissecting it, laying it bare as a system of predictable inputs and outcomes. While they saw chaos, she saw a complex but solvable equation. "Engineering," her voice commanded, slicing through the air. "Chief Warrant Officer Davies, report. You have a cascading power failure in primary and secondary conduits. I need you to bypass the primary generator relays and manually engage the tertiary turbine. It's a closed-system geothermal unit. You have 60 seconds before the capacitor banks are fully depleted. Move." From across the hangar, a grizzled older man, the base's engineering chief, stared in stunned disbelief. "The tertiary turbine is a myth. It was a prototype. It was never brought online." "Chief." Vance's voice was utterly devoid of patience, as cold and hard as diamond. "The schematics I am looking at say otherwise. It was installed. It is operational, and you are wasting time. The access panel is behind the west coolant reservoir. The activation sequence is Delta Niner Tango Echo 4. Execute." She had not looked at a screen. She had not consulted a manual. She was reciting the information from memory, from a library of knowledge so vast and arcane it seemed inhuman. The chief, a man known for his stubborn refusal to take orders from anyone below the rank of colonel, simply stared for a heartbeat, his mouth agape. Then, something in the sheer, unassailable confidence of her voice broke through his skepticism. He turned and ran, shouting for his team to follow. "Ahmed Bey, this is Vance," she continued, her cadence never faltering. "You will have multiple crush and laceration injuries in 5, 4, 3, 2, now." As she finished the countdown, a massive section of the hangar's roof, weakened by the wind, buckled and collapsed onto a section of empty tables, sending a shower of metal and insulation raining down. The timing was so precise it was terrifying. "Prepare for mass casualties. I am activating the emergency reserve blood supply via remote override. The refrigeration unit code is unlocked. Tower, this is Vance. All air traffic control systems are compromised. I am taking remote control of the base's perimeter lighting array. I am going to use the strobes to create a sequenced pulse pattern. It will serve as a visual guide for any aircraft still in the air and a demarcation of the primary collapse zones on the ground. Do not touch your controls." She was not giving suggestions. She was orchestrating a symphony of survival. Each command was precise, complex, and aimed at a specific, critical failure point. She saw the entire base not as a collection of buildings and people, but as a single, interconnected organism, and she was its central nervous system. She was the surgeon, and the storm was the disease. The onlookers, including Gunnery Sergeant Thorne, were frozen in a state of profound, humbling awe. The woman he had dismissed as a weather girl was now single-handedly holding their world together. She was commanding colonels, directing chief warrant officers, and predicting the storm's every move with chilling accuracy. Her plain face was now a mask of absolute focus, her slight frame the unshakable fulcrum around which the entire base's survival now turned. She had become the calm at the center of the storm, and her quiet, unassuming presence had transformed into an aura of power so immense it was almost visible, a shimmering heat of pure, unadulterated competence. The red-lit chaos of the hangar had transformed. It was no longer a scene of panic, but of a strange, focused reverence. The remaining personnel stood or knelt where they were, listening to the calm, authoritative voice that issued from the speakers, a voice that was weaving a net of order and reason to catch them as they fell. Thorne himself was on one knee, his head bowed, not in prayer, but in a state of cognitive shock. His universe had been turned inside out. The pillars of his understanding, rank, physical presence, aggressive confidence, had all crumbled to dust. In their place stood a single, immutable truth. The quiet, 5'5" civilian contractor he had just humiliated was, in this moment, the most powerful person he had ever met. He was a witness to a masterclass in crisis management, so far beyond his comprehension that it felt like magic, a kind of terrible, beautiful sorcery against the rage of the sky. Just as the storm reached its shrieking apex, a sound even more powerful than the wind cut through the din. It was the thunderous, earth-shaking roar of heavy turbine engines fighting their way through the tempest. A set of massive armored blast doors at the far end of the hangar, doors Thorne had only ever seen used for receiving heavy cargo, began to grind open against the force of the wind. Through the swirling vortex of sand and debris, a shape began to resolve itself. It was a behemoth, a heavily modified Sikorsky CH-53 Super Stallion, but one unlike any Thorne had ever seen. It was painted a flat, non-reflective black, and its fuselage was bristled with an array of strange antennae and sensor pods. This was not a transport helicopter. It was a ghost, a machine from the classified black budget world. The colossal aircraft did not land so much as it embedded itself into the hangar opening, its engines screaming as the pilot held it steady against the hurricane-force crosswinds. Its rear ramp slammed down, and a team of soldiers emerged. They were not Marines. They were clad in advanced, form-fitting black combat gear, their faces obscured by helmets with integrated optical systems. They moved with the silent, predatory efficiency of apex predators. Their weapons held at a low ready, scanning the chaotic interior of the hangar. They were operators from the highest, most secret tier of the special operations community. Leading them was a man who radiated authority as naturally as a furnace radiates heat. He was older, his face a roadmap of hard-won experience, etched by sun and time. On the collar of his uniform, where rank insignia would normally be, there was only a single, small, silver emblem, a stylized dragon eating its own tail. He was a command sergeant major from the Joint Special Operations Command, a living legend whose real name was known to only a handful of people. His call sign, however, was whispered in awe throughout the intelligence and special forces communities. Cerberus. Cerberus swept his gaze across the damaged hangar, his eyes taking in the scared Marines, the collapsed roof, and the general state of pandemonium. His gaze passed over Thorn without a flicker of recognition. Then, his eyes locked onto the small woman tethered to the wall by the comms cable. His entire posture changed. The hard, tactical readiness softened into something else entirely. Recognition, deference, and a profound, bone-deep respect. He strode forward, his boots making no sound on the debris-strewn floor. His team fanned out behind him, forming a silent, lethal perimeter. He walked directly to where Elias Vance stood, her eyes still closed in concentration as she dictated a final series of commands regarding structural reinforcement priorities. He stopped a respectful 3 feet away from her and waited. He did not speak. He did not interrupt. He simply stood, a statue of patient deference, waiting for her to finish her work. The most dangerous man on the continent was standing at attention for the unassuming weather technician. Vance issued her last command. Reroute all available power to the east perimeter struts. They are showing a shear strain of 0.98. Acknowledge. A static-laced confirmation came back. She fell silent, her body seeming to slump slightly as the immense burden of concentration eased. She took a single, deep breath, and then she opened her eyes. They focused on the sergeant major standing before her. Cerberus, she said. Her voice, now without the amplification of the comms system, was quiet again, but it held a new resonance. You're late. The models predicted your arrival 3 minutes ago. The legendary warrior actually smiled, a rare crack in his granite facade. The models didn't account for a headwind that was trying to peel the skin off the bird, Architect. He then straightened to his full height, his back ramrod straight. In the red glow of the emergency lights, surrounded by the wreckage of the storm, he executed the single most profound gesture in the military lexicon. He snapped to the most rigid, formal position of attention Thorn had ever seen. He raised his hand in a salute so sharp, so precise, it seemed to cut the air. It was not the casual salute one gives an officer. It was the reverent salute reserved for a Medal of Honor recipient or a visiting head of state. Ma'am, Cerberus's voice boomed, clear and formal, a declaration for all to hear. Command Sergeant Major William Stryker, Task Force Omega, we received your Condition 0 broadcast. The asset is secure, and we are prepared to facilitate Protocol Chimera. Your orders? A wave of comprehension, so powerful it was almost a physical force, washed over every single person in the hangar. The name, Architect, the protocol, Chimera, the call sign of the man saluting her. These were not words, they were keys, unlocking a reality they had never known existed. This woman was not a contractor, she was not an analyst. The name on her badge, Elias Vance, was a whisper, a cover. She was the architect, a figure spoken of in hushed, fearful tones in the highest echelons of strategic planning. She was not a person who predicted disasters. She was the person they sent to unmake them. She was the military's ultimate failsafe, a human supercomputer of crisis management whose authority superseded generals and bypassed entire chains of command. Her jurisdiction was chaos itself. The unit she commanded, the mythical Task Force Omega, was a ghost entity that existed outside of normal military structures. A team of hyper-specialized engineers, operators, and scientists who were deployed to handle events that had no precedent. The Condition 0 events. Gunnery Sergeant Thorn felt the blood drain from his face. The floor beneath him seemed to fall away, leaving him in a cold, empty void of his own catastrophic ignorance. He had not just insulted a civilian. He had publicly assaulted one of the most powerful and protected strategic assets in the entire United States military arsenal. He had tipped over the lunch tray of a living weapon, a woman whose clearance level was likely higher than God's. The magnitude of his mistake was so vast, so cosmically stupid, that his mind could not fully process it. It was like a private punching a five-star general, but infinitely worse. He had committed a career-ending, life-altering act of professional suicide, born from the laziest and most primitive of his prejudices. Vance held the sergeant major's salute for a moment, then gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod. "At ease, Sergeant Major. Get your team to work on reinforcing the primary hangar struts. This storm has another 2 hours at peak intensity. I want seismic dampers on all load-bearing columns." She unplugged the cable from the wall, coiling it with the same neat, efficient motions she had used to eat her stew. The storm still raged outside, but inside the hangar, a new, more profound silence had fallen. It was the silence of awe, of fear, and of a world remade. After the storm had passed, leaving behind a world scoured clean and rearranged by its fury, a new kind of quiet settled over Fob Erebus. It was the quiet of reconstruction, of damage assessment, and of a deeply altered social order. The legend of that day was already spreading through the base like wildfire, whispered in maintenance bays and briefing rooms. The story of the quiet weather girl who had tamed the storm and commanded legends. Elias Vance, the architect, was no longer an invisible cog. She was now a figure of myth, regarded with a mixture of terror and reverence. People gave her a wide berth. They avoided her gaze. They spoke her name in hushed tones. 2 days after the storm, Gunnery Sergeant Thorne was ordered to report to the small, prefabricated building that Vance had commandeered as her command center. He walked the dusty path to the building like a man walking to his own execution. He had not slept. He had replayed the scene in the mess hall 1,000 times in his mind, each viewing more agonizing than the last. He knocked on the door, his hand, which had once seemed so powerful, now feeling clumsy and weak. "Enter," her voice commanded from within. Thorne stepped inside. The room was Spartan, filled with humming electronics and glowing screens that displayed complex, multi-layered maps and data streams. Vance sat at a central console, her back to him. She did not turn around. "Gunnery Sergeant Thorne," she stated, her voice as flat and clinical as ever. "You are probably expecting a formal reprimand. You are likely anticipating charges under the Uniform Code of Military Justice. Article 93, Cruelty and Maltreatment. Article 117, Provoking Speeches and Gestures. Article 128, Assault." She listed his crimes without emotion, her words like sterile instruments laying bare the sickness of his actions. Thorne stood rigidly at attention, his eyes fixed on the back of her head. He braced himself. "Yes, ma'am," he managed to say, his own voice sounding foreign and thin in his ears. "That would be the conventional solution," Vance continued, her fingers still dancing across a keyboard. "It would also be inefficient. Your career would be over. The Marine Corps would lose a senior NCO with 20 years of experience, and you would learn nothing, except that you chose the wrong person to bully. Your prejudice would remain intact, merely suppressed. You would leave the service bitter, and the institutional culture that allowed you to believe your behavior was acceptable would remain unchanged. That is an unacceptable outcome." She finally stopped typing and swiveled her chair to face him, her pale gray eyes locked onto his. "Your arrogance, Gunnery Sergeant, is not a personal failing. It is a tactical one. You made an assumption based on incomplete and faulty intelligence. You saw a small, quiet female civilian and assessed her as a non-threat. Your assessment was catastrophically wrong. In a combat situation, a mistake of that magnitude would not have resulted in a spilled lunch tray. It would have resulted in coffins. She let the words hang in the air, each one a heavy weight pressing down on him. She was not angry. She was dissecting him, deconstructing his failure with the same dispassionate precision she had used on the storm. It was a far more profound and devastating punishment than any shouting match or formal charge could ever be. She was reframing his macho pride as a form of operational incompetence. Therefore, she said, standing up, your punishment will not be punitive. It will be educational. Effective immediately, you are reassigned. Your new orders are to report to me. You will be my personal aide for the remainder of your tour on this base. You will carry my gear. You will maintain my equipment. You will stand guard outside my door while I work. You will be my shadow. Thorne's blood ran cold. This was a fate worse than any court-martial. It was a sentence of sustained, daily, public humiliation. Every Marine on the base would see him, the mighty Gunny Thorne, reduced to the role of a glorified bag carrier for the very woman he had assaulted. You will observe, Vance continued, her voice dropping to an almost hypnotic quiet. You will watch me work. You will learn how to gather intelligence before making an assessment. You will learn that authority is not derived from the volume of your voice or the insignia on your collar, but from the demonstrable quality of your knowledge. You will learn that the most dangerous threats are often the ones that are the quietest, the most unassuming. You will learn to see the world not as a hierarchy of loud noises, but as a system of complex variables. You will, in short, be re-educated. Is that understood, Gunnery Sergeant? Thorne could only nod, his throat too tight to speak. He saw the cold, inescapable logic of it. She was not destroying him. She was rebuilding him, whether he wanted it or not. She was going to force him to become better, and the process was going to be excruciating. It was a punishment of terrifying elegance, a subversion of justice into a form of forced enlightenment. And so, the fable of FOB Erebus was born. For the next 6 months, the sight of Gunnery Sergeant Thorne trailing silently behind Elias Vance became a fixture of base life. He stood with stoic endurance as she conducted her work, his face an unreadable mask, while she briefed generals and directed colonels with her quiet, unassailable competence. He learned the language of atmospheric physics, of structural mechanics, of predictive modeling. He learned to anticipate her needs, to have the right sensor ready, to understand the subtle shifts in the data streams she monitored. He never spoke unless spoken to, and slowly, agonizingly, the lesson took root. He began to see. He saw the strength in her stillness, the power in her intellect. He saw that her silence was not weakness, but the calm focus of a mind operating on a plane he had never imagined. The story of what had happened became a teaching tool, a cautionary tale told to new arrivals at bases across the theater of operations. It was a modern military fable about the dangers of assumption, a lesson passed down from one generation of soldiers to the next. They said that on Thorne's last day, as he prepared to board the transport plane that would take him home, Vance met him on the tarmac. She handed him a small, sealed data chip. "Your final lesson, Gunny," she said. "A new way to see the storm." Then she turned and walked away, disappearing back into the anonymity from which she had emerged. Years later, Rex Thorne was no longer a gunnery sergeant. He was a sergeant major, and he was one of the most respected instructors at the Marine Corps' Advanced Non-Commissioned Officer Academy. He was known for his calm demeanor, his quiet intensity, and his almost fanatical devotion to a single core principle. He would stand before each new class of promising young sergeants, the future leaders of the Corps, and he would tell them a story. He would tell them about a dusty day at a forgotten base, about his own arrogance, about a bowl of spilled stew, and about a quiet woman who taught him the true meaning of power. Your biggest threat, he would tell them, his voice low and resonant with the conviction of a true believer, is never the enemy you can see coming. It's the one you underestimate. It's the one you dismiss because of how they look, how they talk, or what's written on their uniform. Your assumptions are a tactical liability. They are a weapon the enemy can use against you, but more often, they are a weapon you will use against yourself. Let your actions be your argument. Let your competence be your rank. Look for the quiet professional in the room. Find the person who doesn't need to shout to be heard, because that person, I promise you, is the one who truly knows how to win the war. He would then tap a screen, and a complex weather simulation would appear, a swirling vortex of unimaginable power. Now, Sergeant Major Thorne would say, a faint, respectful smile on his lips, let me show you how to see the storm. Let me show you what the architect taught me. And in this way, the lesson of Elias Vance propagated. It became more than a story. It became doctrine. It became a part of the institutional DNA, a quiet, powerful force for change, proving that the most profound victories are not won with explosions and gunfire, but with the slow, steady, and undeniable triumph of quiet competence over loud-mouthed ignorance. True strength does not need to announce itself. It is simply recognized when the storm comes, and it is all that is left standing when the storm has passed.